Matter of public record, excellent. So no pressure at all. So we're going to talk about the plot and the story of Abraham today, which will come as news to everyone. But I went over it in a cursory fashion last time, talked about the broad contours of it, and then talked about the story of Jacob as well. And I'm going to look at both of them, but I'm going to take a couple of classes having sketched out the outline to dig down and talk about those two stories. Because it seems to me that the story of Abraham, and I said that last time, is a heroic narrative, and it's episodic. I talked about how it was the episodes were causally linked, and not just arbitrarily connected little snippets of stories. I think the same thing happens, by the way, in the gospel narratives. The gospel narratives there is a causal link to one episode to the other, and which is interesting when you see speaking of the Gospels now, when you see that a story that's told in this Gospel is told at a different place and a different time in Jesus' ministry here. This is problematic for those of the historical critical method, because they always want to see things as a sequential thing necessary. So this happened, and then this, and then this, and they assume that that was written that way or intended that way. And so some of them will posit as a solution to the problem that same sermon would have been preached more than once, which is entirely plausible, by the way. So he would have said this, given this parable, and then he gave it again at a different venue, and the writer recorded the earlier instance, or this writer did, and then this other writer recorded it later. I think that that's entirely plausible, but I think that there's also, when you think about what the Gospels are intended to do, they're not intended to be a historical snapshot per se. They are intended to be a historical document, no doubt about that, but the purpose of the documents is to demonstrate who Jesus is and why he came. And so the narratives that are given, or the episodes that are given, are there to fulfill that particular purpose, and they're connected causally. So this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. It's not to say that Jesus didn't say those things. They're clearly saying he did. But the gospel writer is making the connection in the sequence that he has for that particular reason. So it shouldn't trouble those who are troubled by the historical critical perspective and saying, look, we have discrepancies between the accounts. These problems arise because of the methodology, not because of the accounts. And to note that these problems do not occur prior to the historical critical method. They simply don't bother people. So I think that's the problem with the method. It's pointing at a problem that's a non-problem, other than for those that want to subsume it under a historical critical method. And the methodology that goes with it is that, again, what comes first cannot possibly predict what comes after. And furthermore, what comes after is normed by what comes earlier, and it can't be authoritative looking backwards, but the scriptures plainly state that Jesus is the author and finisher of the faith, and that when he says something, that it is the Lord's declaration on what has happened in the past. So that doesn't happen with ourselves, for instance. So I can't give you the definitive word on what happened in the regime, or let's say in Milton's life. But with romantic hermeneutics, this is just a broad introductory comment, with romantic hermeneutics, Friedrich Schleiermacher, who's the father of modern hermeneutics, modern romantic hermeneutics, he says that we can know as well, if not better, than the original authors. As well, if not better, than the original authors. And the reason why he says that is we benefit from the distance of history, and so we are not caught up in the web of prejudices of the authors of that day, so we can see from the vantage point of distance what's true and what's false. We just need to recover a picture of what happened in that period, and then we will know that. And so therefore, even if an author in that period says anything, we can overturn what that author has said because we know better. Right? Because of the distance of history. we're objective, whereas they're caught in their subjectivity as if we were objective by virtue of distance. And again, there's a chronological bias, as C.S. Lewis calls it. There's also the bias of progressivism, that things get progressively better as time goes by, which is, again, an assumption that nobody makes prior to the Enlightenment. And it's part and parcel with the historical critical method. So in historiography, there's something called the Whig view of history, which is precisely that. It's a view of history in which things are improving over the course of time and will always continue to improve infinitely. And the way they do this is by eradicating prejudice. And so the less prejudice we have, the more progressive we are. Now you can see that operating today in contemporary politics and society. But it's been applied to the discipline of history, and for that matter to the Bible, for many generations. And so we're just experiencing that as a problem, and it really is a problem, because one of the prejudices that they are now seeking to eradicate is that of human nature. It can be redefined. And the human family, for instance, so that can be redefined. Because those are prejudices, and we need to remove prejudices in order to make progress. So you'll recognize that in contemporary politics. I'm just saying it's been there in the historical critical method, at least the seeds or the roots of it were there, and we are now seeing the outpourings of that. Does that make any sense, at least? Okay, yes? No, go ahead. Question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of something Dr. Peter Craig said. Sometimes we design complexities to avoid uncomfortable simplicities.
Sure.
And I'm thinking these guys must have some kind of an agenda for doing this.
Well, it's almost the opposite here, though. They've constructed a simplicity in order to avoid, again, other simplicities to some degree, that the family is a pre-political unit. I mean, everybody comes from a family. They have a father and a mother. It's a necessary biological condition for human existence. It's a bit of the chicken and the egg. Which comes first, the individual or the family? Well, Scripture says the individual. There was an Adam and Eve, and they constitute the first human family. But they also existed then before nations. But nowadays, you would not know that. You would have thought that nations determined families rather than the other way around. So now we get into politics and so forth. But all of these things are inherently political in how you see them at their very beginnings. And eradicating the prejudice doesn't solve the problem. It just avoids a proper solution, to my view. But very interesting. But those are just prefatory comments as they occurred to me. But I'm always reflecting on how historical documents work, and the hermeneutic interests have always been a part of my personal narrative as a scholar since I studied it back in Durham in the 90s. So now we come to the history of Abraham, the father of nations. And I want to look at the story of Abraham as it's told all the way back to 1127. Oh, I don't have it on the screen, sorry. Is that there now? Oh, but it's under 13. To Genesis 25, verse 10. And we're going to look at the methodology of the story. And what I'm going to suggest is the methodology that we will apply here can be applied to other biblical narratives. So we're going to take it as a test case for how biblical narrative works in terms of the methodology with which we approach it.
Professor, could you
Yes.
kindly spell out the last name, Friedrich?
Schleiermacher? Oh, gosh.
Yeah. Sorry.
I most certainly can. It's obviously German.
Thank you.
Brilliant man. A schoolmate of Hegel, and a famous German poet by the name of Hölderlin, for that matter. I guess I have to write that down too. Hegel I probably don't, and Hegel you will know, but Hölderlin probably not. I did part of my master's work on that poet. These three fellows were instrumental in the development of German thinking Hegel's methodology, his phenomenology of the spirit, was vastly influential in the development of the university from the 19th century onwards. And there were two different strands there. There was the historic humanistic approach of the Christian humanities that you'd find in British universities, and there was the new German university that Hegel, to some degree, gave the foundation for, Schleiermacher also, in which they banished theology from the university, for instance. So that in the early 19th century, the University of, I think it was the University of Berlin, but I'm not 100% sure about that now, so I'm just speaking off the top of my head. Gosh, what was the name of the founder of that? Just drawn a complete blank. At any rate, it started a university without theology, and if you think about the history of the university, it began out of Christian institutions, and theology was the queen of the liberal arts and the sciences, and now theology was deposed from it. So it was no longer the guiding structure for understanding all of knowledge. Big shift. It's the inauguration of the human sciences as opposed to the humanities. The humanities, the human sciences are called the Geisteswissenschaften. The Geisteswissenschaften.
No. I can't say it once. Slow.
Geist is spirit, Wissen is knowledge, Schaften is a faculty. The spiritual sciences, the various faculties of the spiritual sciences. In English, it sounds funny, spiritual sciences, so we call it human sciences. And of these spiritual sciences, we find new disciplines arise. Psychology, sociology, anthropology, these are new sciences. Studying humanity from an objective vantage point using romantic hermeneutics and the historical critical method, applying it to man as a whole, the study of mankind by humanity, claiming to be objective, an objective study of the humanities without any appeal to theology. In my own work, I said the problem of us studying ourselves is that we're both the subject and the object of knowledge. In order to be objective, however, we have to get rid of all subjectivity. How can we be the object of our study and be objective about it? It's like trying to say that's my shadow, and I'm going to jump on my shadow, and the shadow moves every time. So we're inherently biased. It's an impossibility. And the only thing that will get rid of the sense of bias is by eradicating prejudice. So it becomes the pedagogy of the human sciences eradicates prejudice by means of a universal prejudice against prejudice, which I talked about in the first class. I think it's infinitely problematic for all sorts of reasons, and the main one being that it assumes that we know what human nature is, and we don't. We do not know what human nature is because we are humans. Unless we get rid of the distinctiveness between humanity and the animals, which is one of the approaches that is popular in our very day. Anyway, that's a whole lecture unto itself. I want to get to Abraham and say, let's look at this as a methodology that can be applied to any story of the Bible, and we'll analyze it in a literary fashion. So the plot, let's talk about the plot. The plot is just the arrangement of events in a story. There are three principles that are connected to plot, and these go back all the way to Aristotle. When I say to Aristotle, Aristotle enumerates them. They already exist in plots. He just says, okay, he identifies it and distinguishes them. There's unity, and there's coherence, and there's emphasis. He digs down on what constitutes unity as well. So a plot is not just a succession of events. It's not just one event after another. it is a sequence of events. Because if it was a succession of events, you could change around this event with that event and nothing would be changed in the story. But there is a sequence of events, and the sequence is important because the one has a consequence for the one that follows, and so on. And this is why the study of history matters for Christians, not only because God himself is the author of history and enters history as a man, but because that history is the venue for God's providence to be witnessed, and history matters because people matter and individual lives matter. So history doesn't matter in most religious philosophies. It just simply doesn't matter because human life doesn't matter. The soul matters because the soul is eternal, but human bodies don't matter. Human lives don't matter. In the Geisteswissenschaften, human bodies don't matter. The spirit matters, but not the body, and they separate the two. If you're interested in an exposition of that, look at Nancy Pearcey's Love Thy Body, contemporary author talking about some of the ethical problems that have ensued as a result of this mind-body dualism. It's an ancient heresy. So there's a sequence of events. They have, and it sounds funny to say this, but they have a beginning, they have a middle, and they have an end. When I say it sounds funny, we would say, of course they have that. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You write an essay, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. Well, I've read some of the essays over the years, and they certainly have a beginning. The middle is sometimes indistinguishable from the beginning, and it ends, because the words stop. But it's not actually, there's no connection between the beginning, the middle, and the end. But there is supposed to be a sequential connection. Isn't that fun? This is what happens when I ad-lib and speak off the top of my head. It's terrible, and now it's captured on... But it's true. Undergrad essays sometimes lack that coherence. And it's partly because life appears to us chaotically. But an essay is supposed to have a structure, and there's a sequence there to it. And stories most certainly do, if they're a good story. Postmodern stories don't have that feature because they reflect the worldview of their authors. So there's an event, and then there's another event, and there's another event, and there's another event, and how do these events relate? Well, they're just a succession. There's no rhyme or reason to them. Game of Thrones is one such example, by the way. I'm going to beat the heck out of that every time I can in public. Like, what's going on with Game? Do you think it has a purpose? Because every time we get a protagonist that we like, they get killed off, right? So the good guys don't live, but the bad characters most certainly do. Now there is a ethics being taught there, most certainly, and the succession of events then has it is teaching us something about politics and ethics. But it's not teaching us that politics and ethics is in any way a moral enterprise, in any way, or that human beings are driven by it. So it's cynical all the way down to the ground. It's a cynical worldview is being presented, and it suggests that there is no sequence here. It's just one story after the next. So a beginning, a middle, and an end. There you can see the events in their episodes, but you can also see the whole thing as one connected episode. So the life of Abraham, the story of Abraham will be concluded when Abraham dies. And yet there are narrative episodes in there that are also stories within the story. And they are sequentially connected. This is very, by the way, when we say it's a historical document, it's very different than a journalistic account. Journalistic account is simply giving us the most information, most important information at the outset. If you ever read an article, it gives you the synopsis almost right at the outset, like a psychology paper will give you the abstract at the beginning. It's basically giving you all the information you need, and then you read the rest of it. And it confirms everything that you've read thus far, and then it summarizes it at the very end. That's not how stories work. For stories, the order of the information comes only at the importance is only evident at the end. So you actually have to get to the end of the story to realize the importance of the story. And that's why you continue reading. Right, so it's very different. The purpose, and thereby it's telling you that actually the events that happened matter. Just by the virtue of the way it's being told, it's telling you the human experiential significance of events in the life of Abraham matter to him and also matter to us. That means that our lives matter in their details right now, because they're connected to who we were in the past and connected to who we will be in the future. And all of those are connected to God's story with again those same linear constructs. There's a beginning, and there ultimately will be an end, and our story is connected to his story, and our stories will be meaningful in the light of how God concludes history. So it matters how you carry on your life to the very end, and you'll know the story and the significance and the meaning of your life. At the end of your life, you'll look backwards and be able to tell what was important in your life, and you can do that right now, even though you're young. You can think back to terrible or good events in your past, and they have more meaning as time goes by in the light of what you've become, whether for good or for ill. So stories are very different. And so I think that's just a really interesting observation, just right at the outset. Now, paragraphs in a newspaper account, on the other hand, you can omit them, you can rearrange them based on the space that you have to write the article, and nothing is lost. Nothing is lost. Doesn't make a difference. Whereas in your life, every little day is potentially meaningful. Well, they are all meaningful, but some of them will jump out, and you don't know until you're done what those events were. But they're based on, I will submit to you, ethical choices you make along the way. So there'll be a path. You're on that path, and you will find there's an obstacle, whether it's opposition, whether it's health, whether it's who knows what. You'll have to make a choice. When you make that choice, you go down this road as opposed to that road. And based on the reasoning that you came to that decision, your character will have been changed. I talked a lot about character last time. And the story of Abraham is about, to some degree, about character. His destiny is clear. God said, you're going to be this. Come out of here and go here. And he does. That is a monumental event in his life. It happens very early on. Remember, and it's compared and contrast with his father. This is really interesting. Let me go back to this if I can. So in Genesis 11, come here. Terah. Terah's descendants. I have to stand here. These are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. Terah took Abraham his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Why is Terah going to Canaan? Do we know from the text? No, we do not know. We're given no indication, but he is leaving, or to go to Canaan. It's almost like the story of in the Odyssey, where we have the story of Agamemnon. As Agamemnon returned home from the Battle of Troy to find his wife having an adulterous affair, his wife Clytemnestra with a man by the name of Aegisthus, and the two of them conspire to kill him, and they do kill him. And then his son, Orestes, avenges his father for the injustice done against him. And then that story is told as what a bad thing that can happen to you if you are not careful, Odysseus. So mark this. And then we get the story of Odysseus, but the one is a backdrop for the other. Well, here we have the story of Terah having left the land of Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan, and yet he stops along the way, and he dies there. And that's all. It's nothing more is said about it. Why was he going to Canaan? It's not incidental, because that's exactly where, well, we'll find that Abraham is called. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went. Very short and sweet. As the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And where are they going to go? They're going to the place where the Canaanites are. The very same place where his father set out to go and then stopped. He stopped along the way. He didn't go to the place he intended to. Why did he intend to go to Canaan? Any guesses? Based on the story, we're left to infer it. It's certainly not stated, but I would have thought a reasonable conjecture is that he had a sense that God was telling him to go there. But it's not stated. He dies there. He dies there in the midst of his idolatry. Ur of the Chaldeans, Babylon. This is a bad place in terms of idolatry. Abraham leaves that place and heads off there. So he has made, there's a choice that has been made. And the father, we're not told about the choice, but we're told that he dies there, and the call comes to Abraham, and he chooses and he goes. And now we're going to hear his story, but we're not even going to hear the story about his father, because the choice he made was to stay in Haran. That much we have, and that's all that we have. Did it come to his dad and he said, "No, I'm not going to go there because it was too hard"? And then we get the story of Abram. Now, Abram is a hero. This is a heroic narrative. Abram is a hero, just like we will find throughout Western literature. When we come to plot organization, the usual way that they work is through conflicts. There can be a wide variety of different types of conflicts. Sometimes it's a battle, like a physical conflict. Sometimes it's a conflict of characters. We have both of those in the story of Abram. There's battles, and there's also Abram falling out with Lot. Or there can be an inner psychological conflict or a spiritual conflict, also evident in the story of Abram, right? He has decisions to make, and they are soul-racking decisions, anguishing ones. Sometimes he fails them. Remember when he goes through Egypt and he tells his wife to pass herself off as his sister? This was not a good moment for Abram. He made the wrong choice. So it's not a tale of entire success. So again, it's the warts and all narrative to some degree there, as I talked about last time. But there certainly is conflict, but the conflict demonstrates a larger principle, which Ryken speaks of, which is the manifestation of a bigger outcome, which is the suspense about the outcome. What's coming? You read on, because the way in which events are being told, because there's a sequence of event, and this causes that, and this causes that, you think that what happened earlier is going to be important for what happened that follows. And as each connected narrative unit falls into place, you become more and more interested in how it's all going to turn out. because you think it actually, there's a purpose and meaning to the outcome, which has been announced from the beginning because God tells Abram to leave. So if God tells him to do that, and then furthermore promises him that he will bless him, make him a great nation, and furthermore that this is a world-shattering significance because whoever dishonors you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram's the father of all nations. So this is not a small event. This is more important than Odysseus. It's more important than Aeneas. Aeneas is important for the Roman Empire. This is all nations. So he's a hero. This is an epic tale in some ways, just simply because of that detail. Right there. And we want to know how this is going to end. Now, the more they develop our curiosity, the more we like them. And they succeed only when we become curious about them. So this is a quote, and I think I mentioned this from E.M. Forster last time. He says that a narrative can only have one merit, that of making the audience want to know what happens next. Conversely, it can only have one fault, that of making the audience not want to know what happens next, not care. So you just stop watching, or you stop reading, because it's not interesting anymore. You will stop reading if you think that the succession of events is only a succession and not a sequence. At that point, you stop reading. Note for yourselves when you write your essays. There has to be a coherent structure. This leads to that. But same if you're writing a story. There has to be a purpose and a meaning to it, and you have a sense that the author is leading you to that conclusion, and you want to keep reading. That's a good story. Yes?
That's like books like The Lord of the Rings. Where you
Absolutely.
finish the other book after even finished the Return of the King. You wish there was more.
You do.
Going and going through all of Tolkien's works.
Lord of the Rings, you start off, and it's the worst intro to any good literary work I've ever read. Concerning Hobbits, 40 pages. I almost put it down. And if I had not been told how good it was, I would not have prevailed. Because I didn't give a rip about hobbits. I really did not care about hobbits. But I was going to concerning hobbits, and I think, okay, I'm just going to suck it up and keep reading. And then once I started reading, and then the narrative sequence, an event just happens, apparently accidentally. But Gandalf rides in and meets with Frodo and the events, and then there's this. So this is an apparently accidental, but an important figure. He happens to meet with these relatively insignificant figures, and I've just heard about how weird these hobbits are. They don't like water, and they're afraid of water, and they like eating, and all, okay. Still of no interest per se, but then suddenly there's this one ring, and what is this ring is mysterious, and you get a sense that the events have happened not accidentally, but there's a providential ordering to it. Now I'm starting to read, and then other things start coming, and then there are the 9 riders that ride in, and bad guys are very curious about what's going on, and they've got to go, and you've got to go now, and there's a rush, and so now the adventure has begun, and you start reading, and you read, and it speeds up, and you can't put it down. I just, like, the more it went on, the faster I wanted to read it. Like, it's just relentless. But it started so improbably with this stupid concerning hobbits. It's terrible. Tolkien, the scholarly geek who really, all those sorts of things really mattered to him. But in terms of a story, this is a terrible way to begin a story. And then, as I said to you, he concludes it, and Aragorn doesn't even wed his beloved in the context of the story. It's in the appendix. Perverse man. Like, come on. At least the movie got that sort of right, funnily enough, right? Because that does matter. That's an important conclusion to the story. Then the story concludes. Although there's a sense that even in that, remember, he passes the book on to Sam and says, now you're going to write the next chapter in the story. That's true and that's important, but it's not going to be as sequentially important as what's just transpired, unless Sam is going to go on a similar adventure. He'll just be a footnote to the importance of the story that just happened. But evil's not yet been destroyed. Remember, that's how that concludes. But anyway, now I'm getting off topic here. But yes, all good stories work this way. But most of what is currently written is not a good story because they've lost a sense of the purpose and the meaning of history, and that's partly because they're progressives and they think that the progress consists of eradicating the prejudices of the past towards a future which will be better, but they can't even tell you how it's going to be better. We're just going to have to wait. But nobody knows what that's going to look like. Not even those who are eradicating the prejudices in the name of progress. They have no sense of it. And everyone knows it, including them. It still has a purpose. The purpose is to eradicate prejudice. Okay. I'm not sure I like that, because I see myself as part of the prejudice, as in I'm a human being and I'm a prejudice to be eradicated by this methodology, so that I can become a pure spirit, a phenomenology of Geist. Yes?
Like those that say they do not know how to eradicate prejudice themselves, but they would give that to someone else to do, and to let someone else do it well.
No. They'll be the authors of it. It's the scientific elite. It's what Lewis talks about in The Abolition of Man. The conditioners, they're wanting to experiment on other people, but they would never subject themselves to the same experiment. It's like I've said with Silicon Valley, they'll give you their iPads. You know, you should get one of these and you give it to your kids really early and it will really help their development, but they won't give the iPads to their own kids because they're psychologically addictive and destructive to the development of the personality, which everybody's observing now, and they knew back then, which is why they didn't give it to their kids. So why do it? Well, follow the money. So we want to analyze how a story engages our interest and how it arouses the curiosity about the outcome. That's what we're going to analyze here. Now, there are different ways of doing that. The main strategy is establish plot conflicts that require resolution. So what are those conflicts and how are they going to be resolved? And note that all the way back in the beginning of the story, even before Abraham is called, back in Genesis 11, I read this to you, there's a mention of Lot, and he's only a nephew, and he just gets, there's a lot of people that would have been offspring there, but Lot is specifically mentioned for the purposes of what is going to come. And these become vivid characters, and we also have to identify with the characters. We have to like them and care about the characters. And if we don't, then we're going to lose all interest in what happens again. So in general, they have to be good individuals. They have to be morally upright. People that we admire. Just like a tragic hero, he has to be superior to us in some way. Whether through station or character or probably both. And then human interest is piqued by what happens. Also in the biblical story, but even in, again, think of heroic narrative or epic, a whole host of divine human encounters between Athena comes down and speaks to, first of all, Telemachus, and then later to Odysseus. And we find that she's interceding on Odysseus' behalf before Zeus. How on earth have we left Odysseus to go to seed on this island with this nymph? You know, he is heartbroken that he can't return home. This is scandalous. He's done nothing wrong. He's a good man. The gods will be rebuked for being unjust if we don't bring him back home. And we're very interested now because even the gods are speaking of the renown and the virtue of the human character. So now we want to know about this guy. He's a hero, and yet his life is in ruins. His family is being besieged by suitors, right? So all of that, very interesting. And the gods are intervening then even. That's how important it is. Well, here we get the exact same thing. God is intervening in the life of one man by the name of Abram. Not yet Abraham. His name's going to change. So these divine human encounters are part of this. Now, how is the suspense created? Well, right here, there's no plot conflict. Genesis 12, 1-9. No plot conflict. Simply a declaration of what is going to happen. gives away the whole plot. If you were in a writing course, they'd probably tell you, never do this. You know, you got to suspense. If there's going to be suspense, you got to keep a twist in the tail so that the reader is wondering what's going to happen. That's why you keep reading. But in biblical stories, the plot's always given away. In the Odyssey, it's always given away. In Milton's Paradise Lost, it's given away. In the Aeneid, it's all given away. You already know what's going to happen, and yet you still read it with suspense. Right? Very interesting. So the curiosity and the suspense has nothing to do with the actual outcome, which is already certain. You know how it's going to happen, or you know what's going to happen ultimately. So the suspense lies in the telling of the story and the events and the sequence of the events and how is this going to transpire. That's what keeps you reading. But you know how it's all going to end, and it doesn't matter one bit. And you will find that when you watch a favorite television or movie, even if you know the outcome, you still want to watch it. So it's not the suspense about what will come, it's the suspense about how characters react in situations and create the character that is different here than before the decision was made to go down this path as opposed to that path. You know, when somebody says enough is enough and I'm not going to tolerate the injustice any longer, and turns his face against the machine and decides he's going to be different, like in 1984, now we're interested in this character and what's going to happen there. But at that point, he becomes an individual when he makes that choice. So what do we have here? We have the call of Abraham. There's no plot conflict. He calls God to leave his native land, and Abraham, and this becomes characteristic of him, he promptly obeys. There's no hesitancy. Are there any thoughts that have gone into this? We don't know. He just obeys. He does it without hesitation. There'll be a lot of theologizing about this in the New Testament. The man of faith, and a great deal written about this moment, but as it's told, we're told nothing other than that God says it and it happens immediately. He obeys. That doesn't mean that there isn't any hesitation. There's no wrestling internally, or internal spiritual struggle. We're just not told about it. We're just told about the obedience. And maybe that's because in the end of the day, that's all that matters. Never mind how difficult it is. Are you going to do it or are you not? So the call is a demand for a response. When God speaks to somebody, they can't ignore him. They can't pretend they didn't understand. We're not told, by the way, how Abraham knew that it was God that was speaking to him. That it was not some demon, that it wasn't, in our way of looking at it, was some sort of voices in his head. He knows that it's God, and he knows that he should obey, and he does obey. That's what we know. But there is an ethical decision, and he makes it. And it is a sort of a test. And it's a test that his father failed to pass. It appears. I'm inferring that from the text. And I'm not sure if it's a valid inference, but at least it seems reasonable. His father wanted to go to Canaan, he didn't get there. Whereas Abraham responds immediately, and when he begins his quest for land and descendants, we're very interested in what will happen, because that is quite the outcome. You will get all of these things. Now note that he's given the promise of what he will get before he even goes. That's a pretty good incentive. Pretty darn good incentive. First conflict, next episode, Egypt. We'll move on to 12. Have I got 12 here? I do have 12 here. Okay. That is very interesting. There's a famine in the land. If we're attentive, we will think of other famines that will take place in biblical narrative. And of course, having read the whole account of Genesis, we'll know that there'll be another famine that will also be instrumental in God's purposes of getting his people to Canaan, that of Joseph. Right? Also very important, and those are important events. These are terrible events, by the way. Universal hunger, whole nations and families of nations struck by famine. But this is a typical conflict story here. We have a danger to his life. He's afraid because he's in a foreign country. He doesn't have any allies. Remember, back when he was in Ur, he was a wealthy man, and he left that. So now he's left his whole social network. Abraham is an immigrant. He's not illegal. He hasn't. There was no wall. He's wandered there, but he's gone to a place where he doesn't know anybody, so he's vulnerable. Because people that know you are to some degree part of the framework that you can rely upon. He has just got his wealth. Okay, well, that you can buy people with wealth, or you can at least create allies, but also you are a very great prize for any robber band to come upon you, if you think about it. Wealth is, to some degree, an insulation against attack, but it's an incentive for attack. But we're not told about that here. Abraham comes into the land of Egypt, and he assumes that he is in a life or death scenario. Now, why he should do so is unclear. What we know about Egypt after the fact will make it clear. Egypt is the mortal enemy, and like Pharaoh, etc. This becomes the land of slavery, but it's not yet the land of slavery. Why should he be so anxious about the Egyptians? But he is. He thinks if he goes there, that they're going to kill him and take his wife. So there's a life and death struggle with Pharaoh, at least in Abraham's eye. And so here's the first conflict, and how does it present itself? It is in terms of, are you going to be faithful and trust in God, or are you going to do the expedient thing? You know what I mean by expedient? Practical, pragmatic. You're going to try and manage your own affairs and not trust. And you're going to make ethical concessions. Abraham makes a bad choice. He decides he's going to manage it. He's going to do the expedient thing. He's going to compromise his wife and his own character. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife." Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. This is a great deal of anxiety being expressed. His wife presumably is beautiful. Why does he think they'll kill him and take her? Maybe it's the practice of the day. He's a foreigner. He's got a lot of money. They can take his goods and his wife, inherit the whole shebang, but they got to get rid of him. Maybe that's why. But he's willing to give up his wife, pass her off as his sister, in order to save his own life. Why is he saving his own life? Does he not know that he's going to be father of many nations? God's going to